and I will turn
Well,
them over to you.
thank you so much, Arlen. And it is such a pleasure to be with all of you today. And, it's kind of crazy that the school year is starting already. I know that August comes quickly, and I hope that all of you have had an opportunity to take some time to reflect and recharge. And here we are, about a year and a half after the first news of a worldwide pandemic. And I'm sure if I asked every single one of you, where were you when you first heard of COVID, you could tell me. And we're almost looking at COVID as like this line of time that it was either before COVID or after COVID. And each one of us has a unique story to tell. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen so we can get right into today's seminar. And my hope today is that you are able to gain a little bit of semblance of how to tap into calm, because we know that even though the pandemic and the word COVID means one thing, we know that the word stress means another. And that's not something that just goes away. So I'm going to hope that today is going to be valuable for you. And if you want to take an opportunity, I would love to hear, type into the chat one thing that you're looking forward to today, one thing that you want to gain, and maybe one thing you want to lose. So while I'm sharing my slides, you go ahead and type into the chat, what is it that you want to learn or gain today? Right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, as I mentioned, with the pandemic, all of us could probably say where we were when it happened, where we were when we found out the news. And I would guarantee that many of us felt like, okay, we got this and we'll be prepared, but it was leaving us feeling unprepared for the toll that this would take on our lives. So this seminar, as Arlen mentioned, is an interactive workshop that will help you identify how stress impacts your mind, your body, and your overall health. And we know that this translates into every area of your life. Because if you don't feel well, it's hard to be well and do well. And what can our expectations be of those that we serve if we are not well? So first of all, I want to take a moment to honor and thank every single one of you for your sacrifices and your dedication in the last 18 months to spearhead the movement of education without missing a beat. Truly honor yourselves in this moment. Thank you. Now, as Arlen mentioned, my name is Elizabeth. My last name is Priller, and I'm a registered nurse of 21 years. I'm also a certified health coach, registered yoga teacher, meditation instructor, and I spent a few years in law enforcement and in the firefighting world. But I think what would interest you the most is I was a high school teacher for 5 years. With all of that experience, I have 10,000 hours of expertise in two things: in stress and in talking. And so I consider myself an expert in how to build a sustainable life around stress. In fact, for the past 2 decades, I've helped people find tangible ways to rewire their nervous systems, to optimize their DNA, which all helps them feel good in their minds and their bodies so that they can execute their purpose, living a flourishing, thriving life. Now, if you're familiar with the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, you may have heard this quote before, that between a stimulus and a response, there is a space. And think about that gap of space. And in that space is our power to choose a response. And it's in our response that lies our growth and our freedom. So today is going to be about widening the gap between stressor and response, learning to move towards a more robust state of resilience. So since you're all from the education field, I know it's important for us to identify what our goals and outcomes will be for today. We're going to start with identifying our states of being, and there will be an opportunity for you to self-identify where you feel you are right now today. Also, we're going to be identifying the stages and the types of stress responses in the body. We're going to differentiate between foreground stress and background stress and why this affects different people differently. We're going to have an opportunity for you to integrate your core values and your stress responses and understanding how stress affects our executive functioning. And then lastly, generating and designing your personalized calm game plan to build resilience. But first, I'd like to start with a story. And I'd like to tell you a story of my father. Then that picture that you see right there is my father and I. I was probably about 4 years old. When I was 19 years old, I graduated nursing school. 6 weeks later, I received a phone call while at work. And that phone call was from a hospital in the Chicagoland area. The person on the other side of the phone said, "We are sorry to let you know, but your father's here in the ICU and he's not doing well. We need you to come right away." So I made the 2.5 hour drive without a cell phone to the Chicago hospital. And where I made it to the reception office, and they said, "I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that name," which was my father, Ellis Chambers. Finally, they were able to locate his ICU room, and I took the long elevator ride up to the ICU. As the doors opened, I was greeted with a very cold feeling. I saw the first person, and it was a nurse. And I asked the nurse, "I'm looking for my father, Ellis Chambers." And without hesitation, this person said to me, "I'm sorry, we already took him to the morgue." And that is how I found out that my father died. Now you can imagine at 19 years old, alone, hearing that your father is in a morgue had to be a shock to the system. The grief response was, of course, hysterical. I fell to the floor. My body became what didn't feel like my body. And I cried out and said, "I do not want any part of nursing if this is what nursing is." And it was at that moment that a nursing supervisor came over to me and said, "This is exactly why you need to be a nurse, because you now know what it's like to hold grief, shock, pain, and loss." Now, I shared that story because for the next 6 months, I was not in a good place. The severe stress took a toll on my mind and my body. I had never heard the word stress management. I had never heard the word resilience. All I had heard was that my father was in the morgue. Now, I'd like to bring a concept to your mind because we all probably have experienced something of that nature, something of that magnitude that has shook us to the core. And the concept that I'd like to bring up to you is something called the hindsight window. And this is the gap or the space of time between what we perceive to be bad, scary, loss, grief, and the time in the future where we perceive this with gratitude. The longer that that hindsight window is open, the less peace we have. So 21 years later, I am here to pleasantly say that it was because of my father's death, because of the response that that supervisor had with me, that I am so grateful for the experience that leads me to be here with you today. But this calm that I'm sharing with you, that I now have access to, was not always accessible to me at the time. So how do we access our calm? Well, I would start with a challenging statement that we tend to take better care of our cars than we do ourselves. We are only as well as our current level of adaptation. So wherever we were in our adaptation cycle when the pandemic happened is how we responded. And that carries through in every area of our life when stress happens. So today I'm going to help you identify and activate this calm center that we all have. But first, let's do a pulse check. This is on page 6 of your workbook. And this pulse check reflects 5 states of being that I mention in my book, The Migraine Method. The first state, suffering. This is where we have an immense level of grief, loss, depression, apathy, and we are truly suffering on a physical, mental, emotional, or relational level. Surviving. Surviving is when we know that we're pushing through, we're keeping our nose above water, but every single thing that comes to challenge us pushes us back down. We're going through the motions. State number 3, striving. We've identified that we are not well, we're not functioning well when we're suffering, when we're surviving, and we are making concerted efforts to be well. But it's daily practice, and we're not quite there yet. Flowing, we have probably heard the term flow state, and we know this is when we're in our optimal state of thinking, where our challenge is equal to our experience, and we are feeling our very best. But the flow state is transient. Thriving, on the other hand, is when we tap into a calm center, that we have flourishing, thriving qualities of our life, and we are tapping into a regular practice of flow state. So I'd like you to take an opportunity right now, just a self-assessment, no judgment, no wishing, but just an honest assessment of where we feel we are right now. Suffering, surviving, striving, flowing, or thriving. And regardless of where we are right now, we know that these states of being change, and they can change daily. But then COVID, right? Pandemic stress, big T trauma versus little t trauma. We know that background stress and foreground stress have a different expression in our lives. There's a research study by the American Psychological Association that showed that parents, and I would estimate to change that to say that anyone that cares for children could be added to that group, are more likely to rate their stress an 8, 9, or 10 on a 10 scale. So what does this mean for people that fit into all sorts of different groups? We know that background stress, this is the stress similar to a Bob Ross painting. So if you're a Bob Ross fan, you will appreciate this, that the background is often muted. It's only brought into focus when we draw our attention to it, but it's always there. Background stress could be the world pandemic. It could be issues happening in different countries that maybe don't directly affect us, but we're aware of it. All you have to do is pull up your news feed and you'll see background stress. Foreground stress, that's different. Foreground stress is what's meeting you right in your face. So we take this ambient stress plus our daily struggles, and it's amplified when new stressors happen. And our usual coping mechanisms will fail when we either choose not to adapt or adopt new strategies. So I'd like you to take about 15 seconds and write down a background stressor and a foreground stressor for you right now. There's ample opportunity for this in your workbook, or you can certainly just grab a Post-it note and write that down. As you're doing that, as you're writing down a background stress and a foreground stress, we know that we've all been affected by the pandemic in different ways. Think about some of the ways that people have responded. Think about some of the ways that it's changed your life in the short term and in the long term. And let's take a moment and think about this. What do you feel are the reasons that people have different responses to stress? So this is your first opportunity to locate the chat function. And Arlen, I'll have you just share with us, with the group, some of the responses. Why do you feel or what are the reasons, I should ask, that people have different responses to stress? So that's question number 1.
Okay, feel free to type that into the chat. You can send that to everyone or send it to just Elizabeth and myself, and we'll make sure that your responses are recorded here. Okay, this is from Jeff Hill. Perception of how control you have in your life. Thank you, Jeff. Michelle says no control over the stressors.
I hear the word control.
Oh, okay, thanks. Jeff just updated his perception of how much control you have in your life.
Thank you, Jeff.
Diana says situational concerns, jobs, food, housing, relationships with others, good or bad. Nick says past experiences.
Well, we'll pause there. First of all, I want to thank everyone for those responses, because the piggyback question to that, then, as you're contemplating why we have different responses to stress, is how does this stress then trickle down into the workplace? And how does it affect the big purpose picture of those that you serve? So how does that, all of that you just discussed, trickle down into the workplace and affect the people you serve? This is a deep question, so we'll give it a moment.
Yes, they're probably frantically typing those responses in now. Anne says, well, first from Demetra, different personalities, baggage, aces that you bring. Anne says mood response to questions or comments made by others. Michelle says distraction is likely. April says it is reflected in my attitude, actions, and how I respond to others.
And you know, that last comment is so true. And thank you so much for being vulnerable and honest that it does. It affects our knee-jerk responses that we have with other people. Any others at all, Arlen?
Yes, Erin says reasons behind the students' behaviors.
Park that. Can we like flag that? Because we are going to come back to that exact statement. Thank you so much for whoever offered that, because we will have an opportunity at the end to reflect on that question and that statement. Now, I have found very common responses with other organizations when I've done this program. So let's talk about why the pandemic, or in this case, stress, affects people differently. Now, while this seminar today does not serve as medical advice and is strictly for educational purposes only, I want us to understand that the problem lies in our bounce back. We know that research shows that over 90% of diseases or disorders are linked directly to stress. And we know that that plays a huge factor in our ability to stay well and do our jobs effectively. Now, a term that I would like you to park in the back of your mind, if you're not familiar with it, is homeostasis. Those of you who have had any medical training, you understand this word, and certainly those of you in the education field, homeostasis simply means balance. And this is specifically balance in the body and the mind. Things such as our thirst, our body temperature, sleep, hormones, our ability to eat food and metabolize it. In fact, the tiny little area in the brain that this takes place in is in the middle of your brain, and it's often referred to as the security guard, or what's better known as the hypothalamus. So we know that stress is a problem. So what is stress? Well, when we simply define it, stress is the body or the mind's reactions to change or perceived threat. And I heard someone earlier say the perception of, and this is very similar to compare to a weight limit on a bridge. We have a bridge with a weight limit of 150,000 pounds, but we tried to put 275,000 pounds on the bridge. We know that the capacity and the tensile strength of that bridge is not designed to handle the additional stress. But too often we do this with ourselves. We get the warning signs, we feel it in our body, we know it in our minds, but we continue to push through. And those security guards in our brain are there to warn us and to keep us safe. So let's talk briefly about stress. There are 3 stages of stress responses. We first have the alarm phase. And this is basically, think about it, there's a fire in a building, the fire alarm goes off. And then there's a response. And that response is either we get the appropriate help, we call the fire department, we get out the fire extinguishers. And then the third response is exhaustion. And it's not in the form of I'm tired after a long day, but it's when we do not heed the alarm. The body has certain responses. And over time, it could only handle that for so long before those systems become exhausted. Now, what we're doing today, again, is we're widening the gap. We're widening the gap between the alarm and the response, because too often in chronic stress, What's happening is there's an automatic response. And I heard someone say that earlier, that knee-jerk response. And what's happening there is it's an automatic response in a stressed brain. We know that when the brain is stressed, it cannot tap into higher executive functions. We know that that perceived threat is first received, then there was a response in the body through biochemicals, changing the way the heart beats, the way the blood pressure is, the respiratory rate, hormones. And we know that we can't even tap into the areas of the brain that we need to do our work. And I'd like to take that a step further. Think about our students. Our students that are coming to the classroom stressed because basic needs are not being met, because this background stress is affecting them just as much as it's affecting us. And then the last part of this cycle is the chronic cycle of stress that, when not mitigated, leads to inflammation and disease. So we know that this system is better known as the HPA axis. And so before I go into an anatomy lesson, we're going to continue on, because my next question for you is, where do you feel stressed in your body? Where do you feel stressed in your body? Now, normally when we're in an in-person session and we're all on camera, is I will have you grab your right hand and point to where in your body you feel it when you get bad news, you've had a stressful day, you have something upcoming that is stressful for you. Now, I would challenge to say that it's probably in one of three areas: the head, the chest, or the gut. How do I know that? Well, research shows that stress presents itself in these three areas: the head in form of headaches, fatigue, trouble concentrating, insomnia, anxiety; in the chest, grief, sadness, heart disease, heart attacks, high blood pressure; and in the gut, indigestion, diarrhea, nausea, weight gain. It sounds like a pharmaceutical commercial, but that's quite a list to know that what's going on in the mind affects the body. And you can probably start to see the connection between stress and disease. Now, the short of it is this: chances are, if you're feeling stress in one of these three areas, it's for one reason. And this is because of what's called the vagus nerve. Now, when some people hear Vegas, they think Las Vegas, but we're not quite on that plane ride today. But vagus nerve is also known as the wanderer, because it's the only nerve in the body that goes from the brain to several locations versus going from the brain to one location. And this nerve has to do with rest and digest. We have two nervous systems, and they can only operate one or the other. One is rest and digest, the other one is stress. So what we're going to do is focus today on stepping out of the stress response and developing ways to activate the rest response. So I asked a question earlier: why do people respond differently to the same stressor? Well, at the end of today's presentation, you'll have an opportunity to learn about your specific stress type. And I'll have an opportunity to share that with you at the end today. Now, one of the reasons I believe that we all have a different stress response is something I call value-based stress responses. In fact, this is so important that I wrote about it in my book, The Migraine Method. And let me explain value-based stress responses a little closer. So our decisions, our beliefs, our actions, and our stress responses all come from what is most important to us, our values. And a value-based stress response is the reaction in the mind or in the body when stress affects the ability to protect what is most important to you. And if you think about that, maybe some of you are already nodding your head like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Think about your top values. And I found that after decades of doing this work, there are three primary stress types, which you will learn at the end of today's program. Now let's take a moment and let's spend about 30 seconds in your workbook to write down what is most important to you. List out two of your top values. It doesn't even have to be a fancy word. Maybe it's family. Maybe it's financial freedom. Maybe it's your health. Maybe it's your freedom of choice. Maybe it's your time. Take a moment, jot down the two things that come to your mind of what's most important to you. And as you think about that, start to look at areas of stress in your life. And we can start to see a connection between how stress is related to our values. Now, why is it so important that we focus and we take time to focus on our values today? Well, the good news is there's research to back it up. There was a study conducted by the University of California that revealed when participants in a classroom had affirmed their values prior to a stressful event, such as an exam, when they affirmed their values first, they had significantly lower cortisol responses to stress. And we know cortisol is the stress hormone. So this affirms that reflecting on our personal values can keep stress hormones and psychological responses to stress at lower levels. So think about this with the people that you serve, the workplace, and even at home. If we're allowed to validate and speak about our values and what's most important to us, stress might not take such a big dent in our system. Now, another study that was performed at Emory University revealed stunning results from mice and the scent of cherry blossom. And if you've read this study, it's absolutely fascinating. Male mice were exposed to a small electric shock simultaneously while they were given the scent of cherry blossom. And you can probably predict what happened, that over time, when they would smell cherry blossom, they would experience anxiety because it was a conditioned response. Where it became interesting is these male mice were then mated with female mice that had not undergone this particular experiment. Guess what happened to the offspring? Those offspring, when exposed to the scent of cherry blossom, had increased anxiety, nervousness, and increased heart rate. So we know that stress is pervasive. So how do we combat it? And I believe the secret is in building resilience. And what resilience is the ability to recover and even thrive following an adverse event. So just like a bridge, everything has a limit. And resilience is building up the strength of the bridge so that when it comes, we're able to recover, opening the gap between stress and response and allowing freedom of choice, which helps us use our rational brain versus our emotional brain. So there's 4 ways that I'm going to share with you today to build this resilience. So when stress comes, you can adjust your sail and find ways to activate your calm for a more equitable and thriving life. So if you're ready, give me a thumbs up, because then I know that you're still participating. So go ahead and give us a thumbs up if you are ready to learn about the 4 calm competencies. So this is going to be on pages 7 and 8 in your workbook, if you're one that likes to follow along. Otherwise, I'm going to lay this out for you. And the first competency to building resilience is to cultivate connection. Now, we know in the last year and a half, we've done everything but connection. We've been separated. We've had to adjust our lifestyles. But we know that connecting with others can reduce depression, can improve relationships, and it gives us the ability to better handle adversity. We know from a measurable standpoint that it raises dopamine and serotonin, and it allows us to tap into the prefrontal cortex. So if you take your hand and go right to your forehead, the prefrontal cortex is where this higher functioning executive thinking is happening. It allows us to balance our emotional system, our fear responses, all by cultivating connection. So what does this look like? Well, let's go to now page 6 in your workbook, and we're going to do our first practice. And that first practice is going to look like gratitude. And our gratitude challenge, I'm going to give you several challenges here. You see it, there's 3 boxes located on that sheet. And the challenge that you're going to have is to be intentional about your gratitude. So the first box that I would like you to do, and I'm inviting you to do this, this is kind of like an appetizer. You take from today what you need and what you'd like. But the first box is I'd like you to identify a friend or family member that you have immense gratitude for, that you're going to tell them that you have this gratitude. And I would challenge you to go as far as to write a letter. Write a letter, make a phone call to a friend or family member. Box number 2 a service provider. This is someone that you receive services from on a fairly regular basis. Maybe it's your garbage picker upper, maybe it's your hairdresser, maybe it's your postal delivery person. Somebody that receives or that you receive services from on a regular basis. And then box number 3, your external gratitude practice is someone that looks up to you. Now, obviously, in the field of education, one of our first thoughts is a child, regardless of what age group you teach, someone that looks up to you and expressing authentic gratitude for that person. Now, what this does over time is this can start to rewire the brain, but we're going to go a step further. And if you're up for the challenge, I would encourage you to do this. The very first 60 seconds of our day, where our thoughts go, wires the brain. If our first thought is when we wake up is, oh, I gotta go to work. Oh my gosh, the alarm is here. I wish I could have slept more. The brain is already starting to wire in a negative pattern. But if our first 60 seconds before our awareness hits the bedroom walls is gratitude, the brain will start to wire for expectancy of gratitude. So that is your first challenge. Now, our next part of this that we're going to tap into is a loving kindness and heart coherence exercise. So I would like to take the next 2 minutes or so to do this with you. So if you are willing to participate, I would encourage you to place the bottom half of your body on something sturdy. So that could mean your seat on a seat. That could mean your feet on the floor. If you are driving, please do not participate fully in this exercise. So what heart coherence is it's our connection with the physical body, the emotional part of ourselves and our mind. And we're going to allow ourselves to just settle into our body. We're going to take a moment to make sure that our head is over our heart and our heart over our hips. Then we're going to drop our shoulders and really let them fall. Right when you think they're dropped, drop them again. Maybe allowing the backs of the hands to rest softly on your lap and drop the shoulders again. If you choose to close the eyes, I invite you to do so. And just start to notice the breath, bringing in a deep breath in through the nose for a count of 4. Pausing at the top and exhaling intentionally for a count of 6. Letting the tongue fall from the roof of the mouth, softly just floating in the mouth, creating a little space for the jaw. And now I invite you to bring your right hand or your left to the heart, resting the hand softly on the chest, and just noticing the rise and the fall of the chest. Over your next few breaths, as you bring in this new, soft, calm energy into the body, reserve about 25% of your focus and your awareness to the bottom half of your body. Noticing the weight, temperature, stillness. And on your next inhale, I invite you to imagine a person that you have deep affection for right in front of you. Maybe it elicits a smile to your face, and really embody this person as you take a deep breath in. Receive their love. As you exhale, send it back. On your next inhale, as you take that breath in, you notice your face softening into a smile. As you exhale, you notice their face softening into a smile. Noticing the breath, but not controlling the breath. Returning the hands back down to the lap. Taking one full deep breath in and exhale, slowly release. As you come back into the space, I invite you to look on page 9 And maybe jot down something that you noticed. What do you notice about yourself now that you didn't notice before? What do you feel in your physical body? What do you notice about your mind? Now, while all of these are crucial for a strong, calm foundation, having the ability to tap into our brain chemistry and balance neurochemicals, releasing toxicity from the emotional centers of the brain, lowering the heart rate, connecting with others, and practicing gratitude. We know that this takes a little bit of legwork. So let's move on to calm competency number 2, which is to aim to stay organized. Now, a key word here is aim. We know that mess creates stress, disorder, and overstimulation. So when we're looking at our lives, let's look at which areas might be the areas that create stress for us. So my challenge to you here is to, number 1, choose a space. Number 2, choose a time. And number 3, choose 15 minutes to keep this area organized. Now, before I lose some of you right now to the notion that I'm encouraging you to do more, this is actually helping you to do less. How much time do we waste looking for our keys every morning? How much time do we waste picking out our clothes? When we simplify and organize one area of our life, it creates a sense of control and stability and groundedness and expectancy that we can preserve our energy for other things. So let's move on to calm competency number 3. Calm competency number 3 is how we are spending our time, our energy, and our resources. And what do we need to let go of? The thing that we're going to focus on today is toxic self-talk. We know that our thoughts drive our beliefs and provide the foundation for actions. We know that those actions, repeated consistently, form patterns, and those patterns turn into behaviors. So how do we minimize the perception of stress? How do we identify what relationships are draining our time, our energy, and our resources? But more specifically, the dialogue we have with ourselves, because we know that our cells are listening. There's science to back this up. It's a conversation for another day, but we also know garbage in, garbage out. We know that neurons that wire together, fire together. That's the pattern that the brain takes for ease, because the brain wants to take the shortest route. Now, in the section of my book about emotions and thoughts, I talk about this. And more specifically, I say, is it any surprise that our mouth is nestled between the head and the heart? So how do negatively wired statements affect the way we feel? How does it affect our outcomes? We can see this connection between our thoughts and how we feel in our physical body. According to the National Science Foundation, an average person has 12 to 60,000 thoughts per day. Out of those, 80% are negative. 95% are repetitive. So only 5% of our thoughts are conscious, new thoughts. And if we were repeating the negative thoughts, does that mean we're thinking negatively most of the time? So how can we tangibly rewire our thoughts? And I believe this is done through mindful movement. Studies have shown that resilience is stronger in those that practice mindfulness, including the ability to reduce cortisol levels. We know that more mindfulness, more being in the present moment equals more resilience. More resilience equals more stress response, less stress response. So how do we connect to the present moment? Breathing, the exact thing that we did earlier, tapping into our breath, which is the conduit between the mind and the body. So at the end of today's seminar, you will receive a free download of my 4 top breathing techniques that will get your calm nervous system to turn on. We know that movement, mindful movement, not thinking about the past and not dwelling on the future, but being mindful and intentional about our movement. When we combine these practices together, we become more present and activate that vagus nerve to respond calmly. Now, everything we have discussed today is wonderful, right? It makes sense. But how do we do this in a practical way? We know that if it's not practiced, a new idea is only as big as the brain cell that it occupies. It's in the action. It's in the action. So we took action today by writing a few things down. We took an opportunity to breathe. And we know that any new habit has to be anchored around a current habit to make it stick. So what is your calm game plan? Is it to cultivate connection through a daily gratitude practice and really gratitude practice? Is it to change the way your thoughts are in the first 60 seconds of your day? Is it to practice heart coherence? Is it to send a letter? It's part of your game plan to aim to stay organized in one area of your life, one space, one time, 15 minutes, and see how that changes your energy. Is it to let go of mindsets or self-talk, toxic relationships? What we allow in will permeate our system. Or is it through mindful movement, giving ourselves the space to breathe and to truly be present? We know that the most important question here is to ask this, and this is the question I was alluding to earlier. And I want you to think about this, and this is an opportunity, Arlen, for folks to come on and really share. Because if everyone in your organization was able to build even just 10% more resilience, how would this impact the people you serve? So the question is, if everyone in your organization were able to build just 10% more resilience, what impact would that have? So Arlen, I'll switch it over to you before we finish today.
Wonderful. So if you'd like to share with Elizabeth your 10% answer, raise your hand and I will unmute your microphone. You can share with us, or you can of course type it into the chat as well. But if you want to do it a little bit more quickly, just feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you. Thanks, Demetra. I will allow you to speak. The microphone is yours.
Hi there. I just wanted to say that obviously when staff members are happier, then they have more patience for their students, more energy, and they're more understanding. And I think it's contagious as well.
Yes, absolutely. What was your first name?
It's Demetra. You could call me D.
Awesome, Dee. Thank you so much. You're absolutely right. It is contagious. We know that negativity is contagious, but so is the other side. Thank you so much.
And in the chat, we've got Nick saying better collaboration, Jeffrey saying better problem solving, April saying more patience, positivity, and productivity.
Absolutely. So all three of those, we can see that we know the outcome. This sometimes is not new information, but it's information that's relevant, and how do we put it into action? And after this last year, when we were learning to swim and grabbing life jackets while we're drowning, that wasn't the optimal opportunity for us to really have those things like better problem solving, patience, productivity. But now we have a perfect opportunity to go into this school year more prepared, to have our teams more resilient. So when we have this ability, I've shared with you the story of my dad and how I had to take the long road of the last 21 years to do this deep work. But I'm so passionate that we all have the ability when we're supported and when we're held accountable. Now, after 2 decades of doing this work, I have found that there are 3 primary stress types. Now, this affects about 95% of people. There's always the outliers that kind of have a combination. And I've concentrated the work that I do into a 10-question quiz to help people identify their stress type and then how to build that sustainable stress. So in the back of your workbook, you will find a link to that quiz. But really, this is about accountability. It's about holding ourselves accountable to others. And this is one of the first steps, by us taking the time today to really be vulnerable and to learn these methods and really understand the impact that stress has on our mind and our body, and the direct trickle down response that it has into our classrooms. Now, when we think about this, I do share some of this in my book. For those of you that are interested, the title of my book is called The Migraine Method. And we go through all of the experiences that I've had as a former migraine sufferer, but it really started with thoughts, a relationship with self, and how we have that inner dialogue. So there is information in the back of your workbook for that. And then the really information that you probably, most of you are like, I really want to know what my stress type is the quiz. And that is in the back of your handbook as well. So even though this concludes our time together and the information I have to share with you right now, I want to take a moment to sincerely thank all of you that stayed present, for your time and your intention to give to yourself. This is for you to fill your cup. And it's only when we're able to tap into our own calm that we can give our best self to others instead of giving our last. And through our contributions, we make this world better than what we came into it. And remember that it's between that stimulus and the response, there's a gap. And in that space, in that small space, is our power to choose. And in that choice is where our growth and our freedom lies. So my last question to you is, what response are you choosing? It's not asking the question that why this is happening to us, but how can I empower myself through it so that at the end of the day, I can look back and have gratitude for the experience. So Arlen, that is what I have today. I'm available for questions. So we have time to do a Q&A. I will come back on screen so that we can do a Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, Elizabeth, so much for sharing that important information with us today. We really appreciate your time and generosity with that. If you've got a question for Elizabeth, type it into chat or raise your hand, which is down at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar as a raise hand, and you can ask your question verbally, which could speed things up for us as well. So feel free to raise your hand and I will allow you to unmute yourself or type your question to Elizabeth in the chat and we will monitor both.
And I always like to say, you know, if you have a question that you would prefer not to say in the presence of the public, my contact information is available on my website, elizabethpriller.com. I would be more than happy to ask or answer direct questions as well.
Okay, looks like we've got a question from Jeffrey. What are the best coping skills for young students?
Yes. So I would like to know the definition of young, because I consider myself a young student.
Of course.
No, with all due respect, you know, really the foundation for, regardless of the age, thank you, Jeffrey. I see grades 3 through 5. That is a prime age for them to understand breathing. And so if you go to the end of the workbook and download the breathing techniques, there are several of those that can be used with children. And what that does is that helps them to understand that they have the power to control the breath. When we are feeling stressed and out of control, the first thing that is the warning signal to the brain is the breath. And if you think about it, a lot of times we spend most of our breathing in the upper lobes of the lungs, where we're just kind of surviving. Or if you think about it, when you get bad news or you get scared, you do this, it's the breath. So when we are able to control the breath, we actually flip the switch into the frontal lobe and the brain gets the message that all is well. So one of the first things I used to have my students do when we came into the classroom is we would write first. They would, of course, have a writing prompt of some sort, kind of get all the junk out. And then we would spend about 2 minutes breathing. then that switches their brain into I am safe, I am well, I'm ready to learn. So the breath.
Okay, it looked like April posted in there. Do you have any strategies for middle schoolers? So moving up
Moving
the
up the
grade.
line, yeah. So middle schoolers, it's very similar. So the breath, but we have to obviously change the methodology because we know that different age groups have different attention spans. And so with the younger group, we can do exercises as you know, with a visual. So there's a bubble that's expanding and allow their breath to match the bubble. As the students get older, it's the same thing, and it's helping them to identify a name with an emotion and then counter that with a breath. And so really, it sounds like a broken record, but it's really going back to the breath. And so many of us are not taught how to breathe. We are just, because it happens automatically, we don't have to think about it. But it is one of the only body systems that we can actively control. So catching people at any age before we see the anxiety, before we see stress take residence in the body, implementing the breath beforehand while they're pretty calm. Because if we use it as, we need to use the breath as a maintenance, not as just a first aid kit. So really looking at it as maintenance, not just as first aid.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that additional information, Elizabeth. Really
Of course.
appreciate it. Okay, feel free to raise your hand if you want to unmute your microphone, or any final questions into the public chat for Elizabeth. Demetra
Yes,
says, so true. Can't believe how hard cleansing breaths into the nose is for others.
Yes, absolutely. Because, you know, we really don't focus on our breath. If you catch yourself during your workday, take inventory. Your shoulders are probably up here and you're breathing right here. So that message is being sent to the brain, get ready because something bad's going to happen. So dropping the shoulders, really opening the chest gives us the ability to really take that full breath. But I will tell you, it takes practice. I remember starting this a few years ago and I'm like, I can't sit long enough to do this. My lungs didn't even feel like they could expand. And so it does take practice.
All right, thank you, Jean, for your comment. Appreciate that as well. Okay, well, Elizabeth, thank you so much once again for joining us and sharing, and I appreciate everyone's participation today. You can follow up with Elizabeth directly if you've got other questions you'd like to ask her offline. I will be sending out a link to this recording tomorrow, and a link to the ISB evaluation form, which once complete, will send you the evidence of completion for getting your PD clock hours if you're joining us from Illinois and want to get 1 hour of PD credit. You are now free to hit the leave session in the lower right-hand corner, and that will log you out for today. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Yes, bye everyone, and have a wonderful school year. Have a wonderful school year. Thank you for everything that you do.